Technically, I'm a bit uneasy about can be implemented by code. Would we not allow social protocols that cannot be implemented by code?
Well, I suppose we could. The definition is, that could be maybe a different definition. I think there's value in at least defining the concept of a totally programmable social protocol. And being
That could be
talk about that concept.
That could be an adjective, right? It could be, oh, implementable social protocol or something like that. I don't think it should be baked into the concept.
There's a distinction though. I mean, yes, of course, implementable would be a good adjective, but I imagine that any social protocol as a whole, not only focusing on the technological subset, wouldn't be either or not implementable. A subset of it would be implementable, and the definition Jonathan is aiming for here is that subset.
Yeah,
that's also what I think.
Yeah, but I'm saying that should be a different name. I'm saying social protocol should include, the name social protocol should include protocols that cannot be implemented in code necessarily, and then we'll have another name.
Yeah, but that's a discussion about. Remember,
yeah,
that's the discussion about naming. So we can call it a potato protocol for now, and then we can pick it up for last. But for now, if we agree on like
what we want to talk about,
exactly, then we can decide on a name later.
Yeah,
so
but on the other.
Go ahead, Marco.
Yeah, we found it very productive to have objectives and be able to speak about the general case and the subsets. I don't know. I'm really -1 on starting from the subset.
I agree on the benefit of subsets, but implementable wouldn't solve it, as I tried to outline.
Okay, so we can argue on adjectives. That's fine. The name of adjectives, as you say, but I'm saying I think the question of we want to start with concepts, fine. I'm saying I'm interested in talking about the concept of social protocol, including ones that may not be implementable, and then speaking about how to restrict it to the also relevant subset, those that are implementable.
Agreed. I think we need two separate names exactly to disambiguate between the two. No disagreement there.
What I always had in mind, and that's how Jonathan and Johannes, what we started, is like, I always understood it as the human-computer-human interaction, basically, like a machine in between humans, and this way,
augmented social.
Yeah, and this way, it's there's by definition technology in there.
Right, and what I'm saying is it would be nice to have a technology less term and then say, okay, here we're speaking about augmented social protocols.
Yeah, so I think we all agree that we need the two different terms.
But there's three different terms here. That's part of the problem, because it's not if you have the general definition that includes the technology and the socio-technical definition, right? That's all encompassing. It's not enough to say that the other one, the one that Jonathan is trying to include here, is the augmented one, because the augmented one is a socio-technical one. You understand? This is the subset of only the technical aspects of the broader concept.
Yep. Okay. And so I love the term social technical protocol. Maybe, although I'm not sure actually which concept it should refer to, but I think I see your three-part hierarchy there, Stephen.
Okay.
Now, what about the part that's purely social? Just to throw something out there, there's the concepts, for example, of conventions. And these are protocols that human beings engage in, but not because they're required to by some technology, that forces them, but because it's a social convention. And so that might be a term that we could perhaps use for the purely social part of a protocol, or the non-technical part.
Yes, let me take it from another angle. We have a social, a social convention. Let me call it that, which is the all-encompassing thing, right? And we agreed that in that social convention, maybe the social convention can be augmented, right? In which case, we can speak about the part of the social convention that is augmented and happens through a computer-mediated process. We can speak of the part that happens without any computer-mediated process. I don't, but I'm trying to say this is a subtractive definition. I'm saying maybe the pure social is or isn't viable on its own, right? It's I agree, it's a thing. There are possibly social conventions that cannot be augmented, or I think that's unlikely, or that aren't augmented yet. That's extremely likely, of course.
I'm not sure I fully follow. Sorry to interrupt, but just what exactly is an augmented? What you mean by augmented?
Or computer mediated. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, once. So a purely social protocol, that is something that you do for social reasons. You know, for example, you walk into a room and you greet people. You know, in different countries there are different protocols, and you do it because it's polite, and there's feedback mechanisms. You know, the negative feedback you might receive if you don't do it. So, you know, that protocol is purely social, right? And then there's a purely technical protocol. You know, like
you're conflating the medium and the reasons, and that bothers me a bit. Like you could have a purely social protocol for non-purely social reasons. Like, for example, quoting in scientific articles. Like before there were computers, scientific articles are just written on paper and you quote other articles. It's a social protocol. It's not for social reasons. There's a lot of, you know, it affects tenure, it affects the verifiability, the transmission of information, it affects all kinds of things beyond social. It's a social protocol. It's not yet been augmented by the machinery of, say, the citation index, which is another social protocol which enhances the original social protocol of quoting. And then that gets technologized and we have more and more augmentation, more and more technological, but it's not about social reasons. It's about the fact that that protocol has not yet been mediated by technical tools, but yet it's a social means protocol for not purely social reasons.
Yeah, actually, like in the line of research I come from, human-computer interaction, there's like this inclination to never look at technology outside of the socio-technical realm because it's meaningless in a way. And I think that more or less aligns with what Marc-Antoine is saying. Doesn't mean that you can't define the thing that it's only the technical part, but I guess it raises the question, why? Why do you want to define that? And when is it useful to disambiguate as such? Because I mean, theoretically, I'm fully on board with this, what you present here. It's more of a why, and why not just incorporate the full socio-technical realm, which I think was also my comment actually on the card.
Yeah, no, I think those are both important definitions. So defining the rules that can be implemented. So if you go to a programmer and say, I want you to implement this protocol, and the protocol is, you know, I want people to be civil to each other. Programmer can't actually implement that protocol, right? Or the protocol that, you know, when you meet someone, you know, the queen, that you know, behave in certain ways. A programmer can't implement that protocol, or the rules for citations of scientific papers.
Well, if you limit the possible interactions with the queen in a messaging platform with only some pre-approved ones, you have implemented it effectively.
Making the distinction between something that you can implement, rules enforceable by code, and the behavior that you hope will be induced because of those rules, when those rules interact with actual human beings, I think is at least a concept I separate in my mind.
I think we understand it also. I mean, there's no reason to keep discussing this if we all understand what you're trying to define.
Yeah. So maybe social convention for the generic social technical and social protocol for the technical part of trying to implement a social convention. I have no problem with that. It's just I'm balking at defining social protocol first without defining social convention, the inclusive social technical one.
Yeah, so would it make sense to define social technical protocol as something that is not only the rules implemented by code? It is rules and rules that people actually follow, protocols that people actually follow, or we want them to follow. But often people actually do follow the protocol for a combination of reasons, partly because of the constraints created by technology and partly because of social convention.
Yeah. The only thing, and here there's ambiguity about social technical, I've been using it in a term in a way that includes purely social or purely technical. It's the union, social union technical, and not the intersection. Social technical, that means rules that necessarily involve both. Right?
Intersection or union is an interesting idea. So a social technical protocol would include a purely social protocol, that doesn't involve computers. And then a technical protocol where there's really very little social convention. People just kind of do things entirely because of how computers have been programmed. Okay, yeah, and then maybe we want to define then. So I think that's a good definition. And there's the either union or intersection definition. Do we also want to define the implementable technical rules that you can give to a programmer?
Well, that's why we started. So I suggest we wrap up this one, then we do the all-encompassing one, and then we can later update this one based on the all-encompassing one, probably.
And I think, Marc-Antoine, you want to change the name of this one.
I'm more interested in it being based on the all-encompassing one. So I would prefer to start with this.
Let's add that other definition. I'm okay with changing the name. It sounds like
no problem with the name, but my problem is it being the starting point.
Are we using these definitions in the user stories? Because else we don't have to fully define them. We could just use them.
Well, this is a Wednesday process. This is not user story driven, so no. The answer is no. But hopefully in some future user stories we can, yes.
So basically, we get to the topics we actually want to talk about because we all know what it's all about. It's just like
but it's about picking a name and sticking to it, because otherwise we don't know. And so that's why you create a glossary.
I mean, it can be a time-consuming process, all these definitions. I agree, but I also agree that once we have a name and stick to it, we will reap the benefits in future. We'll tend to reap benefits in future conversations. But maybe that's enough for now. Maybe what I'll do is try to add a card with a second definition, and we can do that.
Let's talk. I think we at the minimum need to define two names, and one for the social technical one, the all-encompassing one, the union, not the intersection. I find the intersection hard to comprehend even what that means. I think the intersection will be harder to define, but the union is easy enough to define. And then the one you start with, Jonathan, needs a name that's distinct from the former.
Okay. I'll follow up with that then.
So the general one, I would say, socio-technical protocol. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, except it leaves open question, protocol for what?
Yeah, I'm afraid people will naturally interpret as the intersection, which is why I'm a bit hesitant on the name. I'm looking for a good generic name for, maybe social convention, but then people will think it's social only, or just protocol.
Yeah, that's what I just thought, like protocol already.
I'm not certain though, Marc-Antoine, why you think that, because I mean, I just Googled it. Socio-technical refers to the interrelatedness of social and technical aspects. I don't see how that says intersection in any way.
Let's look at it. So I agree that
API literature, it is the union.
I agree totally. In the literature, it's the union. I'm afraid that people who don't know the literature will interpret it that way. But I agree. In the literature, obviously, it's what it's meant. It's the union.
Yeah, and especially people maybe in tech, I think I would certainly be tempted to think of social technical protocol purely
That's the
within from the
intersection.
lens of my approach to online social platforms and how technology interacts with society.
Yeah, that's kind of my point. Well, tech meaning and not in the.
So I might propose though that the most efficient thing to do would be maybe another draft of the card, and then take it from there. We can kind of all think about these definitions or do some research offline.
Yeah, I'm looking for the term Parsons was using. Talcott Parsons, because it sounds right.
But I mean, if we
go on.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we're going to introduce two different terms, it might probably make sense that they align somewhat at one another. I mean, if one is a social technical protocol, it's going to be confusing if the other one is social protocol, but that's then only the technological part of it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. So I think we might have to maybe think of some other definitions. Like social protocol would be the term to use within a group or organization where technology was assumed, which this kind of group kind of assumes the use of technology for organized, structured debate, and so that's why we proposed social protocol. We didn't have to say, social technical, or that was kind of implied.
Can't we, as a working title, just call this current one implementable social protocol, technical social protocol?
Codable,
yeah,
programmable.
As a working title, just so we know what it is.
Codifiable.
Codifiable.
Yeah, no, it's because I'm speaking about codify versus code. It is different. It's something that can be made into rules, clear rules.
Yeah, but the definition is can be implemented by code.
Yeah,
yeah.
You're right.
Because even rules, law is codifiable, but
Yep. So, no, you're right. Okay, fair enough.
So
programmable social protocol for now.
Why not? I'm fine with that, and I think
let's leave the name open, but just so
yeah,
and then we can come to some agreement on the actual definition.
What I'd like is the able version of computer mediatable, but yeah.
And then call it. Oh yeah.
So the next topic is about how, what our interest within CDL is with respect to social protocols. And I was thinking maybe a possible interesting way to segue into that is actually to talk about Felix's paper, because I think that was the paper that kind of got us started.
Which one? The Hacker News?
Yes. Yeah, I haven't read the latest stuff that you guys are working on. I'm sure it's very interesting.
Nothing available yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and because I think it's a real interesting to look at what they're doing. So very briefly, the idea is that maybe the best content or the most interesting or useful content in Hacker News is not always making the front page. But of course, there's the obvious question, well, who's to say what's the best content? Like, how do you define quality content? How do you find value, useful? And the thing is, I think an important insight for me is that you don't have to define it. The idea is, you say, look, we don't necessarily know what is useful, but we know what people upvote. And why don't we just assume that there's some sort of link between, what people upvote and some underlying quality or value, or what people find interesting. We don't have to define that exactly, but very precisely. But whatever it is that is causing people to upvote things, whatever that quality is, that the posts that have that quality are not necessarily making it to the front page because of the design of the protocol. And the protocol is very simple. It's just a formula. First of all, a formula. That formula is very simple. It's number of upvotes with this quadratic penalty for time. So over time, things lose their rank. And then the formula is calculated, and the things with the highest score, according to that formula, show up at the top of the page. And then, of course, what this does is it creates a feedback loop. And the reason social protocols are so interesting partly is because of these feedback loops. Technology, back to humans, back to technology, system, human system. And once something is on the front page, it'll get more upvotes because more people, read it and can upvote it. And that creates this positive feedback loop. And the feedback loop is cycling between human and technology, right? And more people upvote it, therefore it gets ranked higher. Then eventually the penalty kicks in, and even the stuff that has benefited from this positive feedback loop eventually falls off the front page. And, Felix's paper is, look, we can understand this feedback loop and we can analyze it and we can say, okay, are these the outcomes that we want? Or can we improve the outcomes? And so, the question is, how does this relate to canonical debate? And that's, I think maybe it doesn't, or maybe it does, but that, the Marc-Antoine, you called it the interaction between epistemic networks and social networks, and that is something that is maybe not within the scope of canonical debate yet, or that's too much of a, the possibility that social platforms like Facebook or Twitter would somehow integrate in some way epistemic networks into their social protocols is maybe a bit of a stretch, but or maybe just not something that we're ready to spend a lot of time talking about.
For me, I think it's a nice example why what we just call programmable social protocols are not a thing worth looking at in isolation. You need to look at the social technical protocol. You need to look at the fact that you're talking about Reddit, and people at Reddit come to Reddit for social reasons, and people click upvote on Reddit for reasons that are bigger than just the programmable social protocol. And my whole point, because we already discussed it at length in chat, is that those reasons, the whole socio-technical atmosphere in what we envision for CDL is majorly different from Reddit. So yeah, these insights are hard to transfer. I think one of the main things that I mentioned as well, which I think is relevant mentioning again, for example, if you're looking at ranking content like in priority maybe on CDL of what is interesting to discuss, that wouldn't necessarily be true. You might want to rank a falsehood that is stated many times on the front page exactly because it's being stated, yet it's false, and you want to promote it so that people are aware that there's a discussion ongoing proving that this is false. So it depends on what you want to achieve. You need to look at the whole picture.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely. The point of designing the programmable part of a social protocol, because programmable part is the part that we have control over. We're technologists, and we're not, politicians or religious leaders. We're not the sort of people that are going to change people's behavior by making speeches, but we might change people's behavior. It's a funny way of looking at it, but technologists are modifying people's behavior. At least a lot of people think, people at Facebook and Twitter, those engineers have changed the world, and not necessarily for the better. And I think a lot of them haven't thought about, well, what outcome are we trying to achieve besides making money? And so absolutely, I think and we need to think, what outcome are we trying to achieve? And can we actually understand the interaction between technology and people well enough that we can design this technical part of, programmable part of a social protocol, so that what emerges is a whole social technical protocol, and even a whole culture. I don't know if that's a separate thing, that has the outcomes that we want. And so you talk about Reddit. Reddit has, very interesting culture and many different cultures. But you can also trace the development of the different cultures on the different subforums in Reddit, partly to the programmable social protocols. The rules that were put in place, specifically moderation and the rules for moderation, and the fact that each subreddit had a specific set of moderators that had ultimate control over what could be said.
And the whole isolation into subreddits itself, like that's a protocol in itself, like separation of communities inside Reddit.
The what of community?
It's the separation.
Yeah, right, exactly. That deliberate separation.
Subreddits.
Yep. And so they're all things that you can analyze, and you can see maybe in hindsight how those technical decisions resulted in the emergence of culture and convention that has produced certain outcomes. And then one of the outcomes that Stephen and I talked about in chat was, so let's set aside the question of truth. We just talked about consensus building, and consensus based on reason and understanding of other people's reasons, and a thorough exploration of arguments, and that is an end. The canonical debate is a means, I think, and an end. A more well-informed, broader consensus seems like it could be a very good end goal.
For me, it's the closest definition of what some people call truth. I'm just very hesitant to call it truth.
Yeah, I also think whether or not you call it truth, it may be in some sense more important than truth.
Exactly. Because if you find consensus,
to be the total contrarian here and to break the consensus, that is, for me, outside the scope of the canonical debate. I think it's within the scope of decision-making tools, things like that. But what is the function of consensus? If it's getting as close as we can to the truth and that sort of thing, it is leaning heavily towards what I call making a decision, right? And that's I see canonical debate being an input into that sort of thing, but the whole point of the canonical debate, as I've defined it, is to improve people's understanding, individual understanding, so that
well-informed opinions, well-informed personal beliefs and choices.
But how do you do that, and where do you derive them from? And I think what Jonathan and I are arguing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, that ultimately is based on consensus. Because you're not gonna personally hold an opinion to be true if you're the only one in the world holding that to be true. That's what
I think there's two levels of consensus.
That's what I
sorry,
say,
Tim, go ahead. Yeah.
You of course you can hold your own opinion against the rest of the world. Do we think that 97% consensus of science of climate scientists
you can, but if that's
a fact that helps resolve the big debate over climate change? No, it's the opposite. It's a dividing line. It's where people dig in their heels in terms of their biases.
So we're talking about the goal here, right? Sure, you can hold consensus, but what would be the goal of contributing to CDL for you personally? If you're going counter consensus, what is your goal of even adding arguments to CDL?
Before we go deeper here, I'm sorry, talking about two different kinds of consensus here. Like one is the consensus about belief or agreement to a claim or whatever, or to a whole set of claims or an argument. The other one is consensus about mapping out the whole space and agreement on the information that's laid out. And Yeah, just wanted to point that out. And I think
I think
I
that's
don't know
very
if that's a
important.
difference.
We
What do you mean
arguing
by
about
agreement on
the
information? You mean like the shared truth of the blockchain? What do you mean by agreement on information? Or you mean we all agree on the underlying facts, now we come out with our own different opinion on the debate? Are you talking about we agree the information here is the information here? Is that the consensus, like a blockchain consensus?
Yeah, like this is the way the information is structured without agreeing on the individual claims that are part of this.
I'll go a bit further. I think it's not just blockchain. I think it's not just blockchain level. I think it's about saying, yes, my position is well represented on this map. And there's a level of consensus where most participants agree, yes, my position is well represented on this map. Doesn't mean I agree with the other person's position, but it does mean that yes, the map accurately mirrors my position, and everybody agreeing that. That's the first level of consensus that we're speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a one part of that, which is the soundness of the system, which is like blockchain type, which is not the goal of the canonical debate, obviously. It's a necessary feature. That's not what we're trying to do, is because blockchain already does it. We're gonna stick everything on the blockchain done. No, I would put it more towards efficient accumulation of knowledge, right? Or have, to some degree,
what is knowledge?
Like when I say, right, what is knowledge? It's a mixture of, I would say it's useful, challenged, validated information. I haven't come up with a good definition.
I mean, what makes it useful?
I mean, is a consensus, again, if
I would argue consensus makes it useful because it means it's a claim you can use and the majority of people will agree with it. That's
no, but if there's a claim, right, but if there's a claim that's 50-50 divided, I wouldn't say the system has failed. I would say it's done exactly what we want, which is it's provided all the. Right?
I'm 100% with you there, but then the question is, why do you want the system to represent that a claim is 50-50 divided? I think what Jonathan is arguing is that the ultimate goal is to find why it's divided and then come to consensus on other more specific claims or etc.
Right, at least
right. So
is where the division is unnecessary, where,
yeah, exactly.
The 50-50, showing that something is 50-50 divided has a purpose.
It
but
does.
That purpose is not the primary purpose and goes against some of the other objectives of the canonical debate as I see it, right? Because it introduces the bandwagon effect bias, or the opposite, the reaction against consensus, the backfire effect, right? And so presenting that something is 50-50 is a mixed endeavor. And this gets into protocols and what we're trying to get out of the protocols. But what I'm saying is that the objective is not creating a consensus. To me, the objective is, and I don't know a better way to put this, but getting all the arguments out there, giving people the opportunity to refute the arguments or support them, and concentrating that in an efficient, readable way. So each individual can come to their own conclusion, right? And there's a part about, okay, what if you're the one holdout against world consensus? Okay, my belief, either, okay, you be the one holdout, that's fine. Or if it's really a ridiculous position, the system should weed out that sort of thing by highlighting your inherent contradiction, right? How long can you hold what is an opinion totally counter to objective reality, if there is one? How long can you hold that presented all the information, right? Can you only hold that position by superficially ignoring all the information that's been presented there?
Why would the information presented in the canonical debate tell you that you're being a holdout against objective reality?
It doesn't.
I don't know if it should, right? That's the thing I'm saying is dangerous. Yeah.
It's an anti-goal for Tim. It is a goal for me, by the way. But it's one of the few things we really disagree on. Not that many, but that's one of them. Just one small thing, Tim. And I understand why you want to do it. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's here we have different goals. And I'm sure your system has value as much as a system which does show which claims are consensual, dividing, or fringe, as I keep saying. But when you speak of contradictions, not all fringe are fringe by virtue of contradictions. My favorite counterexample to that is solipsism. You cannot refute solipsism. It's fringe because it's fringe, not because it's self-contradictory.
Which is fine. I'm totally fine with that. Yeah, you know, I often come back to the abortion debate because I can see why people have such intense feelings on both sides. And you know, I don't think there's an objective right answer. It depends on your ethics and depends on your priorities and your values and that sort of thing. So I don't think, and here's where consensus comes in, right? What is the purpose of consensus? It's for making decisions and passing laws and that kind of thing. It's okay, now that we have all the information laid out and each person has their own opinions, there's more than one set of opinions here. What do we do with that?
Isn't that
and
consensus?
that is the governance system, huh?
Isn't that consent? I would call it consensus. If you can come to the conclusion that there's valid reasons for abortion or not, given these things you may or may not believe in, which I would call a more specific claim, that is consensus. It means that you, at that point, there's some consensus with those assumptions. I understand and agree with that standpoint, but that doesn't mean that you agree with those assumptions. That is a form of consensus to me.
I don't know if consensus is something that, you know, like making a decision. If the consensus is something I see as, you know, something we've reached a point here. We have defined now that we have consensus.
Well, consensus is limited. Consensus doesn't mean that you can reach a decision on any given point. What I'm saying is you try to increase the level. If you're talking about a contested issue, such as abortion, why I would say the goal is to find consensus is exactly to understand to which degree you can agree with one another and to understand where the consensus stops. But you can only find out where consensus stops by first finding where there is consensus. And that doesn't mean you come to a decision. That means that at that point you can't come to a decision because you can find further consensus. But the only way to do it is by trying to find common ground first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we're playing with maybe different versions of the word consensus.
That's what we started with, yes.
Yeah, yeah, I know. So at the very least, I want to be careful about the definition we use for consensus. And when we're talking, and this is an interesting question, by the way, going back, I never talked about your definition of social protocol. Jonathan, I didn't say a word because you guys were just talking about a lot of things. I thought we would go through the whole process, but my questions were more along the examples. I wanted to maybe go through them at some point, but there's a very important one that comes up here right now, which is, and now I forgot how I was going to say it. You know, the question is the design of the canonical debate. Perhaps as one giant social protocol, because the goals I want to promote, there's a goal, there's something enforced by code, there's a process, and one of the goals is not having any forking, bifurcation, or driving people away. And the goal is to avoid at all costs people giving up on the system because they think it's not fair, or it's not listening to them, or they're not able to participate as an equal. And so I guess it's a social protocol. I never thought of it that way, but it fits your definition as far as I understand it.
Yeah, I think so.
Totally.
But so, like, by one definition of consensus, I would say it's antithetical to the goal that I stated here of keeping everybody in the system as feeling they're being treated equally represented, right?
Yep. Although, let me ask one of the, the 5 whys questions. Okay, you want people to not, if you want to get to the bottom of That's why 5 times. So you want people to not be driven away by displaying, for example, displaying numbers that show disagreement and that might make you feel like drive you away because your view is not represented or whatever. So why do you want to do that? So ultimately you want people to participate in the system, and you talk about improve individual understanding. And obviously you can't do that if people are driven away. But I want to ask, okay, why do you want to improve individual understanding? Is it for broader social reasons? Is it because, hey, this is a tool that you want to use for yourself? Or you think individuals will benefit individually in their lives by having broader understanding? Or is it you think the world would be a better place if people had broader understanding? And why would, in that case, why does it matter if people have broader understanding? What will be the impact on the world? And maybe the positive impact on the world is an indirect goal for you. That is to say, it's obviously good for individuals to have a broader understanding, and maybe that'll make the world less, of an ignorant place and make governments more effective and people better voters. There's lots of indirect impacts, but I want to focus on the individual benefit to understanding. And I think that's like a great goal and it's aligned totally with my goals. I also think creating broader consensus in society is another goal that's aligned with my general goals. That is to say, just the ability for people to agree with each other more will make society better. Consensus is what allows groups of people to make decisions and to work together. And even if even if the consensus is based on ignorance, at least they're agreeing instead of fighting. And I see that alone as also a potential good outcome. But those are kind of like different, they both lead towards maybe, the better world, but through different paths.
Do you want one answer to that? I mean, the whole purpose of the CDL. I do want better collective decision-making tools. I do want better governance. I do want better democracy. I have drawn a line in my mind, in my design of the domain of the canonical debate around it not being a governance tool, it not being a decision-making tool. There's several reasons for that, but one of them is what I said before: is I don't want it to be a system that tells people the truth, specifically because I think it needs to be canonical. So that's one of the things. Avoid at all costs forking, but also give people the breathing room to understand and make up their minds. Now, what is the purpose of that? I mean, it's in general, it falls into the general category, I think, of improving cognitive skills for all society. I think there is an umbrella benefit there. My one personal need, like, the use case that started all this, I would say, is a very easy one that captures it for my own personal benefit, which is, the internet's exploding over this thing. What's it all about? I want to know in a minute. I want to know how well based these different opinions are. I want a quick lookup that I can trust, essentially, right?
Why people think this and why other people think that they're wrong. And the personal knowledge seeking also is a big one for me.
And I think that will have a larger impact on society. Yeah. But for my own personal benefit, it's exactly that. I want the straight dope. I want to go there and have it organized in a way that isn't full of rhetoric and exaggeration.
But it's interesting because how at one point you say you want to have objective arguments, not full meaningless rhetoric. You want all these things, but at the same time you don't want to make judgment about whether or not these things are objective or purely rhetoric. Like how are you gonna determine whether or not something is purely rhetoric or objectively true if you don't have some type of consensus backing mechanism behind that? How me as a person coming to the CDL, if you don't see any form of consensus or lack of consensus in the representation, how do I know what I should trust?
No, I agree with that, and that's why I never discarded popular vote or other scores like that from the system. I just want to be very careful about how they're used.
Yeah,
right?
I think we agree on being careful.
Yeah, an analogy would be a sort of how I feel about liquid democracy versus direct democracy, right? I think this, by the way, one of the goals is it could be a tool that makes that sort of thing more reasonable. But liquid democracy is other people voting for you. You got to trust them to do it, and you can take away that trust or give it back. But it's a scalability thing. If there was a way for every person to come in the system and start at each axiom and build up their beliefs based on that, they had the time for that, then I don't know if I would want the popularity algorithm, at least within the core. But we don't have that. So at some point you've got to go, okay, looks like everybody thinks this is reasonable and I'll go with that. But I don't want it to be at the very top level. I want you to look at a claim and look at the argument and start digging in, and things that seem to go against your opinion, you go and look at, well, what are the arguments about that? I want it to be a tool to investigate more and minimize that bias. But this is where social protocols come into play, right?
The hypothesis, I think one key hypothesis you have, and one I do actually sympathize with, is you want to take popularity out of the equation of opinion forming. People should learn to base their opinion on the argument matrix, as opposed to the popularity.
Again, I think we agree on that as well, right? That's why I always suggested something that's purely popular but not justified, as Jonathan has, although I don't fully understand, but I think we more or less intuitively agree. If something is popular but not justified, of course you want to highlight that. You want to show that distinction.
And the question is, it's true that there is a layer where opinions have to, well, not have to, but can result in collective decisions. If we have a collective decision mechanism, if we have laws and the means to enforce them, which is, some people believe that shouldn't exist, right? That's an opinion too. The anarchist position is very well argued. But if we admit that there are social goods coming from common decisions, which I personally believe is true, then you want the collective intelligence process to yield such decisions. And it is true that it should be done in a way that doesn't cancel the existence of the counter argument, because totally hiding away and disappearing the counter argument is what will have the negative impact that Tim is rightfully fearing, which is people will not feel represented and they'll go elsewhere. Totally agreed. Disappearing the other argument is counterproductive. I'm not sure that this means that the decision layer, which I think has to exist, has to be totally separate from the opinion mapping layer, which is what Tim is trying to build in CDL. I think they can coexist, but it's a social protocol experiment. I mean, Tim is proposing, let's separate those two layers very cleanly so that people can feel they can engage in the argument map, even in a way that the decision layer looks totally separate, so that they know they won't go away from the process because they're not happy with the decisions.
Yeah, of course. I think there's no disagreement there. The decision making needs to be separate from.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that we just had that consensus, right? I think what looked like a disagreement is really just a line that needs to be drawn, and that purity needs to be maintained on one side of the line, where popularity and even consensus don't enter. But on the other side of the line, the maximum value. I mean, even if, Timothy, you create the canonical debate system, someone like me is going to go build something on top of it, whether you like it or not, you know. And of course, I'll try not to.
No, that's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure the layers can be separated, by the way. Just let's not overstate the consensus. I was trying to describe it.
Michael Twine, sometimes I think you don't believe in separating anything. Like really the monolith application that does everything.
It's true.
The protocol that does everything.
Yeah.
I'm a tangled hierarchy type of guy. But
specifically, we've already discussed the one mechanism for this officially. Like we all have agreed we want to design this, which is the scoring mechanism, which could be in the the canonical debate layer. Is just a a pluggable strategy solution where the higher layers inject their mechanisms into it, right? So it's supporting it rather than hosting it.
If you'll just let me finish, yes, I agree that it's worth trying to separate them. And yes, I agree that this is what we discussed as a way to attempt it. I have my doubts it'll work, but it's worth trying. So we have that much consensus. But yeah, I'm a tangled hierarchy type of guy, and I don't believe clean separation of layers is ever achievable. There's always layers seep into one another. But
there's never accurate models. There's only useful models.
That is so. And yes, I believe it is useful to try to separate the argument mapping from the decision mapping. And the other separate question is, decision is one thing, but is it useful to even hide the social status of claims? I think
at some layer, maybe it is, right?
I believe we'll have to use the social status.
If there's not some place where the social opinion doesn't come in, and people that don't kind of agree with the current consensus aren't having that, kind of in their face. I agree that that could be problematic.
I think we'll always need the social layer because we know that it's not worth arguing against an argument because it's too fringe. And there I think Tim will disagree with me, and he's right in some ways, right? Galileo was the only believer of a fringe argument, which was correct at some point. But it didn't stay fringe, and I do believe in the self-correctedness of the human epistemic sphere that way. I think that where I think we do agree is that, what is it? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and a claim's extraordinary for social reasons, and it means it has an impact on how much burden of proof there is on fringe belief, whereas consensus belief shouldn't have, you shouldn't ask a high burden of proof. Like, it's enough to say, yeah, I agree with that. You shouldn't have a huge burden of proof if it's something everybody believes. But, and the other thing is ordering, right? If the map gets crowded, you'll want to not present the fringe at the top. And there is another, I'm balancing Tim's perfectly valid fear of social either conformism or anti-conformism effects, which is real, with the danger of the platform becoming an amplifier for disinformation. And that way.
But that's why the implementable social protocols on the opinion aspect of a base layer need to be very carefully designed not to have that effect.
Yeah.
But I think such a careful design will have to take the social layer into account. I know it's possible to do it purely at the epistemic level, but that's a claim.
So it's our hour is up.